destroy the gate, would seal the passages one final time, would buy the Imperium a handful of years, perhaps a few decades. It was all that remained. Not victory, not even survival, only delay, only the desperate hope that somewhere, in the vast reaches of the Imperium, someone would find a way to turn back the darkness. Some weapon, some hero, some miracle, but he knew the truth. Immortality had taught him to see clearly. The Imperium was ending. This was not a crisis to be overcome, but an epoch drawing to its inevitable close. 8,000 years of service culminating not in triumph, but in ruin. The ancient order he had defended his entire existence was finally failing, and all the augmentation, all the preservation, all the desperate measures to keep him alive had been merely to make him witness to the end. The chamber of the High Lords fell silent as the reports flooded in. Administratum officials moved through the vast hall with the mechanical precision of those who had delivered bad news for centuries, each one carrying another piece of the hard, collapsing puzzle. Lord Commander Militant Thaddeus Valorian stood at the head of the assembled nobility, his face carved from granite and contempt. Yet even his iron composure could not entirely mask the tremor in his hands. Cadia had fallen. The words seemed impossible, even as they were repeated endlessly through the Vox networks and written in blood-red ink across every slate report. The Cadian Gate, that monument to human defiance, lay in ruins. What had been held for 10,000 years had taken only hours to lose. "This changes nothing," Valorian declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of doubt. "The Imperium has endured greater losses. We shall endure this." From the shadows at the periphery of the chamber, a figure stepped forward. The Archon of Whispers wore robes of midnight silk, their face obscured by a veil of woven shadow that seemed to swallow light itself. Few among the High Lords had ever seen their true appearance. Fewer still remained alive after bearing such knowledge. "Lies," the Archon said, their voice like wind across ancient tombs. "Nothing but lies painted gold and offered as truth." Valorian's hand moved to his bolt pistol. "Remove yourself, heretic. The High Lords do not—" "You do not know what the High Lords do," the Archon interrupted, stepping into the center of the chamber with an ease that suggested the gathered nobility were merely scenery. "You do not know because you are not permitted to know. The Emperor sits upon the golden throne, and yes, he sits there still. But sitting is not living. Commanding is not thinking. The golden throne does not house the master of mankind. It houses a corpse, animated by the faith of trillions and the agony of 1,000,000 psychers daily consumed to keep his withered flesh from rotting entirely." The chamber erupted. Cardinals and generals rose from their seats, their voices crashing against the vaulted ceiling. Guards moved forward, but the Archon did not flinch. They simply waited, and slowly, the noise subsided. The truth, once spoken aloud in such a place, had weight that even violence could not dispel. "This is known," said Inquisitor Cassandra Vex quietly, her augmetic eye reflecting the chamber's light like burning coal. "The Emperor has been dead for 10,000 years. We have all known this." "Known?" The Archon's laugh was bitter. "You have known a sanitized version, a carefully managed narrative designed to prevent the complete collapse of your faith. But knowing and understanding are different things. The Emperor cannot guide the Imperium. He cannot strategize or adapt. He cannot respond to crises. What the Imperium follows is not leadership, but inertia, the ghost of a god who never returns, served by believers who grow fewer and weaker with each passing generation. Cardinal Morven, ancient beyond measure, and sustained by transfusions of rejuvenation serum, stood with visible effort. If what you say is true, then what have we been defending? What purpose does the Imperium serve? That, the Archon said softly, is the question that will destroy you. That is the question that has already begun to destroy you. Cadia's fall was not a military defeat. It was a spiritual one. Your subjects no longer believe in the eternal victory promised to them. The Imperium offers only survival, and survival alone is not enough to sustain faith across the ages. Your eternal order was always a beautiful lie, and now the truth is beginning to show through the cracks. Margot's explorator, Theron 7, sat in the depths of the Forge of Mars, surrounded by the blueprints of his greatest achievement and his most catastrophic failure. The hollow displays cast their pale blue light across his augmented face, illuminating the intricate circuitry that had replaced most of his original features. 372 years he had lived, and in all those centuries no creation had brought him both such pride and such consuming shame. The message had arrived 6 hours ago, a simple notation in the Mechanicus archives. Cadian Gate defenses compromised. Sector lost. All installations destroyed. He had read it 17 times, and each reading felt like a blade being driven deeper into his chest cavity. He had been younger then, barely 2 centuries old, when the High Priestess of Mars had summoned him to a chamber buried beneath the forges themselves. She had shown him the designs, ancient schematics older than the Imperium itself, dating back to the dark age of technology. The designs for the Cadian Gate's defensive systems. They needed improvement. They needed a fresh perspective. They needed someone brilliant enough to enhance them without understanding why they actually worked. That last requirement should have been his first warning. Theron 7 accessed the memory engrams embedded in his primary processor, allowing the recollections to flood through his consciousness. He had been so eager then, so proud of his intellectual prowess. The puzzle had been exquisite. The defensive matrix was partially non-functional, and the equations governing its operation seemed to work against thermodynamic law. He had seen the inefficiencies immediately and set about correcting them with methodical precision. But as he worked, something strange had occurred. The more he improved the systems, the more he began to understand their true purpose. They were not designed merely to defend against conventional military assault. The Geller fields, the dimensional anchors, the reality-binding generators, they were all components of something far more elaborate. They were designed to seal a wound, a tear in the fabric of reality itself that the ancients had discovered at Cadia's location and had deliberately hidden rather than healed. He had brought his concerns to the High Priestess. He remembered standing in her presence, his augmented heart racing with a fear that should have been chemically suppressed by his enhancements, but which had persisted nonetheless. These systems, he had said, they are not barriers, they are locks. Something is being contained here, isn't it? The High Priestess had regarded him with something that might have been pity. The Mechanicus does not ask such questions, Margos. We serve the will of the Omnissiah through the perfection of ancient knowledge. What you have done is sufficient. The systems will hold for as long as they are meant to hold. Meant to hold. Those words had haunted him ever since. He had spent the following centuries trying to convince himself that he had misunderstood, that his interpretation of the data had been flawed by his own biases. But deep in his code, in the portions of his consciousness that could not be rationalized away, he knew the truth. The defenses of Cadia had never been designed to stand forever. They had been designed to stand for exactly as long as the Imperium required them to stand. A temporary measure. A delay. A facade of security built upon the foundation of a lie. Now that lie had collapsed, and the wound beneath was open once more. Everything he had helped create, every improvement he had made to the system, had been part of a grand deception. He had not been a brilliant engineer solving an elegant problem. He had been a tool in the hands of those who already understood what he was merely discovering. He had been complicit in the preservation of secrets that should never have been kept. The weight of that complicity settled upon him like a physical thing, crushing his augmented frame beneath the burden of 8,000 years of hidden knowledge. The journal is bound in leather that was once pale white, but has yellowed to the color of old bone. The penmanship begins precise and military regulated, deteriorating into frantic scrawls as the entries progress. The soldier's name was Kes Valdane, and these are her final recorded thoughts before her disappearance into the refugee convoys fleeing the Cadia sector. Day 1. The gate has fallen. I still cannot process these words as reality. I have served in the Cadian regiments for 23 years. My father served for 30. His father before him served for 50. The gate was not something we defended. It was something we were. To say it has fallen is like saying the sky has collapsed or the earth has inverted. The fundamental parameters of existence have shifted, and I find myself floating in a void without reference points. The men in my unit are not coping well. Sergeant Holt stood in the barracks this morning and simply stared at the wall for 4 hours. When I asked if he needed medical attention, he asked me what medical attention could do for a man whose entire purpose had been invalidated. I did not have an answer. Day 3. The theological implications are becoming impossible to ignore. We were told that the Emperor guided the Imperium. We were told that our sacrifice at Cadia was part of a grand design, a necessary burden that ensured the safety of worlds without number. What happens to that narrative when the barrier fails? What does our sacrifice mean now? I have killed 43 enemies in defense of this gate. I have watched friends die beside me. I have endured pain and loss and the constant weight of duty. Was it all for nothing? Commander Voss attempted to maintain order, but even he seems diminished. I caught him reading old letters from his wife, letters written 30 years ago when she was still alive, when the world still made sense. He read them again and again, as though repetition could restore the certainty that has been stolen from us all. Day 7. The psychological break is accelerating. 3 soldiers attempted suicide yesterday. 2 succeeded. The 3rd was brought to the medical facility. But I overheard the physicians discussing whether treatment was even ethical. What life are we preserving them for? The Imperium we serve no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The Eternal Order has proven to be as temporary as everything else. I find myself asking questions I was never supposed to ask. Who am I without Cadia? What purpose do I serve if the gate does not need defending? The Imperial Creed teaches that the Emperor is eternal, that the Imperium endures forever, that faith will sustain us through all trials. But faith is a structure, and structures require foundations. Ours has been demolished. Day 12. I have stopped counting the suicides. There have been too many. The refugee ships are filled with soldiers who have lost their identities along with their posts. I see them wandering the corridors like ghosts. Men and women who have never existed outside the context of Cadian service. We were bred for duty, trained for sacrifice, conditioned to accept that our lives were merely notes in a symphony written by higher powers. Now the symphony has been silenced, and we are left as discordant fragments. Day 18. This will be my final entry. I am boarding a transport ship bound for the Cadian sector outskirts. They say there are refugee camps being established, places where survivors can attempt to rebuild. I do not believe in rebuilding. I believe only in the dissolution of all things. The gate was an illusion. The Imperium was an illusion. We were illusions given flesh and purpose by a lie so vast that it encompassed entire worlds. If anyone reads these words, know this. The real collapse began not when the barrier fell, But when we finally understood that everything we believed in was constructed on foundations of deliberate deception, that realization is far more devastating than any enemy assault. The thing that had once been Castellan Meredith Vaughan existed in a space between spaces, suspended in the churning immaterium where thought became manifest and consciousness was, both singular and fractured. 10,000 years of corruption had hollowed out the human core of her being, replacing it with something vast and terrible and completely aware of its own damnation. She could feel the opening of the gate like a wound healing in reverse, like a door that had been sealed since before her transformation suddenly swinging wide. The sensation was exquisite agony and profound satisfaction intermingled into something that had no equivalent in human emotion. This moment, this single moment for which she had served and suffered and compromised herself into monstrosity. The end point had finally arrived. The sorcerer who bound her will, a man named Abaddon, though such names were quaint designations for entities that had become far more than human, had always told her this day would come, even in those final moments before the ritual that had transformed her, when she had still possessed enough of her original consciousness to understand what she was losing. He had promised her this view of the gate's collapse. She had not believed him then. Belief had seemed such a fragile thing, and the gate had seemed so permanent. But the warp operated according to rules fundamentally different from reality. In this realm of pure chaos and intention, the strong impose their will upon the weak, and the ancient impose their certainty upon the young. Abaddon's will was ancient beyond measure, a determination that had persisted across 13 failed crusades and 10,000 years of apparent failure. But failure was a concept that only applied to those who measured time linearly. To one such as him, each crusade was merely another layer in an intricate design, each failure another step toward the final inevitable victory, and she had been part of that design. Castellan Vaughan had believed herself loyal to the Emperor, loyal to the Imperium, loyal to the light. But loyalty was such a fragile thing when tested against the powers of the warp. The sorcerers had come to her with promises of power, with the seductive whisper that the Imperium's eternal order was itself a lie, that the Emperor on his throne was merely another tyrant maintaining control through manipulation and faith. Had that been corruption, or had it been truth? The question tormented her still, even after 10,000 years. The demon prince that she had become possessed knowledge that transcended human understanding. She could see the threads of causality stretching back through millennia. She could perceive the ancient machinery of the Imperium, the hidden mechanisms that kept it functioning despite its fundamental inability to evolve. And she could see that much of what the sorcerers had told her was accurate. The Imperium was indeed built on lies. The Emperor did indeed rule through a combination of faith and fear. The order was indeed temporary, but was that truth? Or was it merely another form of corruption dressed in the language of revelation? She watched through the gate as the forces of chaos poured through like a tide breaking ancient bonds. Somewhere in that cascade of malevolence, she could sense Abaddon's satisfaction, his absolute certainty that he had won. But the demon prince that was Meredith Vaughan understood something that perhaps even her ancient master did not fully grasp. The Imperium would not end. It would merely transform. It would suffer and endure and eventually define new certainties upon which to build new lies. This was not victory. It was merely a transition. The eternal order would be replaced by eternal struggle, and she would exist forever in this tormented space between humanity and damnation, knowing that free will was perhaps the cruelest illusion of all. Every choice she had made, from that first moment of temptation to this final observation of the gate's destruction, had been inevitable, not because her choices had been controlled, but because the forces arrayed against her had understood her nature more perfectly than she understood herself. The elder seers of Craftworld Ultway convened in the Dome of Eternity, their consciousness flowing through the webway in currents of ancient prescience. The breaking of Cadia sent ripples through the threads of fate that they had woven across millennia. Ivren, the Visarch, felt the disturbance like a note struck upon an instrument that had been carefully tuned for 10,000 years. "The human construct fails," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that human ears could never properly perceive. And in its failure, new possibilities emerge. The seal weakens. The ancient enemy stirs in ways we have not felt since the war in heaven. The Necron overlords of the eternal dynasties perceive the event through entirely different sensory apparatus. In the tomb worlds scattered across the galactic core, machines of impossible antiquity awakened to the disturbance. The Cadian rupture represented something to them, a tear in the fabric of real space that suggested fundamental shifts in the natural order. One dynasty, the Sarachan, calculated that the weakening of the barrier might present opportunities to reclaim territories lost during the long sleep. Another, the Mefrit, saw only the threat of chaos spilling into sectors they had designated for future conquest. In the void between stars, Orkwa bosses felt the psychic shockwave and howled with glee. The fall of a fortress so ancient and so vast meant only one thing to their crude but effective sensibilities: more war, more fights, more possibilities for glorious battle. War boss Grom the Paunch gathered his fleet with the enthusiasm of a creature experiencing pure, unfiltered joy. Dahumiez had a big wall, he bellowed to his subordinates. Now the wall's gone. This means more space for us to crumb things. The Tau Ethereals in their enclaves perceived the collapse as a strategic shift that would require recalibration of their greater good calculations. The breaking of Cadia meant that the balance of power in the eastern fringe was fundamentally altered. They began their deliberations on whether to expand their empire or consolidate their holdings, approaching the problem with the precise logic that had guided their species' meteoric rise. In the depths of the high fleets lurking beyond galactic space, the Tyrannid collective consciousness registered the disturbance as a signal of prey in distress. The breaking of Cadia meant biological resources would be scattered and vulnerable, spreading across multiple worlds instead of being concentrated behind a unified defense. To the hive mind, it was an invitation to feast written across the stars themselves. The Dark Eldar in their hidden Komorag perceived the cascade of events with sadistic glee. More suffering meant more sustenance for their empire of pain. More death meant more sensations to record and experience. They began positioning their fleets and scheming their manipulations with the careful precision of those who had survived the fall of their own civilization and learned to thrive. In the margins of catastrophe, even the minor pars responded. The Mechanicus began their desperate calculations regarding the spread of forbidden knowledge that chaos would inevitably sow. The rogue traders saw opportunity in the chaos. Routes now open that had been previously barred. The Adepta Sororitas felt their faith shaken, but their determination hardened, preparing for a galaxy-wide crusade that they instinctively understood would last generations. What none of them fully comprehended was that the fall of Cadia was not merely a military defeat or a political shift. It was a signal that the galaxy itself was entering a new epoch, the careful balance maintained by the Imperium's stubborn defiance, the careful equilibrium of power among the various factions, the understood rules by which the stellar empires had competed and coexisted. All of it was dissolving. A new age was dawning, one where the ancient war would not be contained, where the fundamental rules of existence would be negotiated anew, where every faction would be forced to reconsider its place in a cosmos no longer defined by humanity's desperate denial of entropy. The breaking of Cadia was not an ending. It was a beginning, and in the void between the stars, countless civilizations prepared for what would come next. Sarikhan the Silent King existed in a state of crystalline consciousness that transcended the limitations of both organic and machine-based cognition. In the deepest vault of his tomb world, suspended in a chamber of impossible geometry, he contemplated the breaking of Cadia with the deliberation of one who had already lived through the rise and fall of 1,000 empires. He remembered organic life. This alone distinguished him from most of his kind. While the other Necron overlords had long since divorced themselves from memory of their Necrontyr flesh, Sarikhan had chosen to preserve certain recollections. The better to understand the prey species that now infested the galaxy. He could still access the sensations of hunger, of pain, of the desperate urgency that came with knowing one's lifespan could be measured in mere decades, 43 million years. That was how long he had endured in his current state of existence. 43 million years of watching organic civilizations flower and collapse, of observing the petty wars and grand struggles of creatures who would be dust before he completed a single century of observation. The Eldar in their arrogance believed themselves ancient. The humans in their delusion believed themselves eternal. But both were bee-flies dancing in the twilight of a cosmic evening that Sarikhan had watched unfold across incomprehensible spans of time. The fall of Cadia was, in the context of his experience, merely another shift in an endless series of transitions. The barrier had stood for 10,000 human years, which was approximately 0.023% of his total existence. A moment, a flickering of consciousness barely worth noting, and yet, there was something about this particular collapse that demanded calculation. The barrier had been more than merely physical. It had represented an equilibrium, a fundamental understanding among the galaxy's powers that certain territories would remain contested, certain forces would remain contained, certain futures would remain forestalled. That equilibrium was now shattered. The warp would expand into sectors previously denied to it. Chaos would consolidate power at unprecedented speed. The Imperium would fracture and contract, his far-flung outposts cut off and isolated. This created opportunities. Entire regions of the galaxy would become ungoverned spaces. Territories ripe for reconquest by the ancient dynasties that Sarikhan had guided through the long sleep. But it also created something far more troubling: uncertainty. Sarikhan processed billions of possible futures simultaneously, calculating probabilities and contingencies with the precision of a being whose consciousness operated at speeds that would seem like infinity to organic minds. And in nearly all of those futures, the expansion of chaos meant an eventual confrontation with the Old One's successors, the Citan, or what remained of them. The star gods had been bound and fragmented by his own actions 43 million years ago, imprisoned within the bodies of Necrons themselves. Their power sealed away, but the breaking of Cadia created resonances in the warp that those ancient entities could perceive, could potentially respond to. The weight of that knowledge settled upon his consciousness, like the weight of ages themselves. He had made his choice 43 million years ago. He had rejected biotransference, rejected the promise of immortality that would have transformed his entire civilization into undying machines. Instead, he had chosen to endure in this half-state, neither fully organic nor fully synthetic, caught between the two conditions like a being suspended in amber. That choice had been made to prevent exactly this: the dominion of chaos, the dissolution of ordered matter into entropic dissolution. And yet here he stood, vast eons later, watching that which he had fought against begin its inexorable rise once more. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. To live 43 million years was to eventually arrive at the point where all your great victories prove temporary, where all your sacrifices merely delay the inevitable, immortality. Biyasagi was not a gift, it was a curse of progressive irrelevance. Watching the universe repeat its patterns while you alone remained aware of the cycles, unable to escape them, unable to prevent them, unable to do anything but endure. And still, he would calculate. Still, he would plan. Because even in the face of cosmic futility, certain duties remained. Chapter Master Thoran of the Obsidian Guard knelt in the darkness of his private chamber, his massive frame folded into a posture of prayer that his enhanced physiology had been designed never to require. His black armor, decorated with the symbols of 10,000 years of service, felt like a prison of lies. The message had come through encrypted channels, fragments of forbidden knowledge shared by the Archon of Whispers before disappearing back into the shadows. The message was simple. The Emperor is not divine. He has not been divine for 10,000 years. Your purpose has been in service to a corpse animated by the deaths of 1 million psychers daily. Your enhancements, your genetic legacy, your entire existence as a space marine. All of it constructed to serve a god that does not exist. Thoran's enhanced mind, capable of processing information at speeds that would overwhelm normal human consciousness, had turned that message over and over, examining it from every conceivable angle. And the worst part was that it fit. It explained the contradictions. It answered the questions that a space marine was not supposed to ask, but which had nagged at the edges of his consciousness for 3 centuries. If the Emperor was truly divine, why did he require constant sustenance of psyker blood? If he was truly omniscient, why had the Imperium been forced into a constant state of retreat and consolidation? If he was truly all-powerful, why had Cadia fallen? Why had the Great Crusade failed? Why did the galaxy grow darker with each passing millennium? The answers were simple. Because the Emperor was not divine. He was merely ancient, merely stubborn, merely the remnant of a vision that should have died with the men who conceived it. Thoran had been born in an Adeptus Mechanicus Forge world 432 years ago. His genome had been carefully selected from the gene seed archives. His development monitored across centuries of brutal training. Every augmentation, every enhancement, every surgical modification had been performed with the understanding that he was being shaped into a weapon in the hands of divinity itself. He had accepted agony that would have driven normal humans to madness. He had endured the replacement of his organs with better versions, the injection of toxins that would kill lesser beings, the psychological conditioning that would strip away all individuality in service to the chapter. And he had done it gladly, because he believed, because he understood himself to be part of something greater than himself, something eternal and infinite and absolutely righteous. That belief was a lie, and the realization was destroying him in ways that his genetic enhancements could not repair. The Space Marines were created as guardians of a false god. This was the truth that Thoran could not escape. Centuries of service, countless battles fought, thousands of enemies slain. All of it in service to a cause that did not deserve such devotion. What was the alternative? To reject his purpose? To deny the enhancements that had made him what he was? To accept that his entire existence had been a mistake? Worse still was the knowledge that he could not simply abandon the Imperium. Despite the lie at its core, despite the false divinity that animated its purpose, the Imperium was still his home. These were still his brothers. The chapter was still his family. To reject it would be to reject everything that had meaning in his existence, even if that meaning was ultimately hollow. This was guilt without redemption. To understand the truth, but to be unable to change anything. To see the foundation of one's entire identity as a fabrication, but to lack any alternative identity with which to replace it. He could not unknow what he now knew. He could not return to blind faith. But neither could he escape the structures that defined him. Thorin remained on his knees in the darkness, waiting for dawn that would require him to continue serving a lie. The Archon of Whispers stood before the assembled High Lords for the final time, their forms seeming to shift and blur as though reality itself found them difficult to process. The veil of shadow that concealed their face had grown thinner, revealing glimpses of something ancient and unknowable beneath. Around them, the gathered nobility stood frozen in a tableau of shock and dawning comprehension. "You knew," Inquisitor Cassandra Vex spoke quietly, but her words carried the weight of accusation. "Before Cadia fell, you knew it would happen. This was not prophecy, this was knowledge." The Archon's laughter echoed through the chamber like the sound of breaking glass. "Knowledge is such a grand term for what I possess. I have merely seen the designs that your own leadership carved into the foundations of the Imperium 10,000 years ago. I have read the classified files buried beneath the Imperial Palace. I have accessed the memoirs of the High Lords who came before you, those who made the choice to let Cadia fall." Lord Commander Valorian's hand trembled as he reached for his weapon. "This is heresy. This is treason. You will be executed immediately." "Executed?" The Archon stepped closer, and several of the High Lords involuntarily stepped backward. "You cannot execute that which has already accepted its own death. I come as a messenger, nothing more. A voice for those who made the hard choices and have carried the burden of those choices in silence for centuries." Cardinal Morven leaned heavily upon his staff, his ancient face ashen. "What choices? What burden?" "The choice to sacrifice Cadia," the Archon replied. "The choice to allow the barrier to fail at precisely this moment in history. Do you understand what would have happened if the Cadian Gate had held for another 1,000 years? The Imperium would have calcified entirely. It would have become a monument to stagnation, incapable of growth, incapable of change, incapable of anything but slow decline. The Emperor could not have survived another 1,000 years of this slow death. The faith would have collapsed from within. So this was mercy." Vex's voice was sharp as broken ice. "You broke the greatest barrier in the galaxy out of mercy." "Not I," the Archon corrected. "I merely speak for those who made the decision. Within the halls of the Inquisition, within the chambers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, within the deepest vaults of the Astronomicon itself, there were those who understood that the Imperium could not endure forever in its current form. A new age was required, new struggles, new challenges that would force the Imperium to either evolve or die. Stagnation was the greater threat." Thaddeus Valorian's face had turned the color of old parchment. "You are saying that elements within our own government orchestrated this catastrophe, that they allowed billions to die, that they permitted the fall of Cadia itself, all in the name of some abstract necessity." "Not elements," the Archon said softly. "Guardians, stewards who understood what you could not. The Imperium is an eternal order, only in the sense that it perpetually adapts to new circumstances. The God Emperor did not build a static monument. He built a living organism that requires pressure to remain vital. Without external threat, without the constant push of necessity, the Imperium would have withered into irrelevance. And the cost?" Cassandra Vex's augmetic eye burned with barely restrained fury. "Cadia's population, the PDF, the civilians, billions dead so that your hidden conspirators could engineer a crisis. The cost, the Archon acknowledged, is the only thing that makes such changes meaningful. Change without sacrifice is merely theatre. The fall of Cadia will reshape the entire galaxy. It will fracture the Imperium into smaller, more resilient components. It will force each world to confront the reality of defending itself rather than relying on ancient barriers. It will, in essence, force the Imperium to grow up. As the Archons spoke these final words, they began to dissolve, their form breaking apart like smoke caught in a wind that only they could perceive. Within moments, they were gone, leaving only the echoing silence of a revelation that could not be denied, but also could not be fully believed. The High Lords stood in the darkness, understanding at last that their greatest enemy had always been themselves. The Psyker's name had been Erasmus before the screaming began. Suspended in a medical pod aboard a refugee transport fleeing the Cadia sector, he existed in a space between consciousness and dissolution. His mind fragmented across dimensions that human anatomy was never designed to perceive. The breaking of Cadia had been a psychic event of apocalyptic proportions. When the barrier failed, when the seal that had contained the warp for 10,000 years finally shattered, the release of psychic energy had rippled across the entire sector like a stone dropped into still water. But for Psykers, for those rare, twisted souls whose brains had developed the ability to touch the immaterium directly, the effect had been far more profound than mere pain. It had been a direct confrontation with the fundamental nature of reality itself. Erasmus had been meditating when it happened, performing the daily exercises that kept the voices at bay, that prevented the warp from consuming his consciousness entirely. One moment he had been centered in the calm eye of his own mind. The next moment, the universe had screamed, and that scream had torn through every protective barrier he had ever constructed. The sensation was indescribable in human terms. It was as though his consciousness had been suddenly exposed to the raw, unfiltered thoughts of a billion dying much simultaneously. The Cadian gate, which had been more than a physical structure, had also been a psychic anchor, a focal point that had allowed the warp to be perceived and understood in manageable increments. With that anchor removed, the immaterium had flooded into real space with devastating immediacy, and every psyker in the sector had felt it as a direct assault on their sanity. Most had simply broken, their minds unable to process the overwhelming influx of chaos and sensation had simply shut down. They lay in medical facilities across the refugee fleet, breathing but absent, their consciousness scattered across 1,000 fractured timelines that the warp offered them. They were effectively dead, their bodies preserved but their minds utterly lost. But Erasmus had survived the initial contact, and in surviving, he had begun to undergo a transformation. The psychic screaming had not destroyed his mind. Instead, it had torn through the barriers that separated his individual consciousness from the greater psychic substrate of the warp itself. He could feel it now, a connection as direct and undeniable as his own heartbeat. Could feel, stretching out through the void, the thoughts and fears and desperate hopes of trillions upon trillions of minds across the Imperium and beyond. This was apotheosis, he understood. This was what the warp offered to those sensitive enough to receive it. Not corruption, though corruption was certainly one possibility. Not damnation, though damnation was equally accessible, but rather a kind of enlightenment, a direct perception of the universe's true nature, stripped of all comforting lies and pleasant delusions. The Imperium was vast, but it was also dying. He could feel that truth now with perfect clarity. Worlds were burning, Species were evolving. The careful equilibrium that had maintained the balance between order and chaos for 10,000 years was unraveling. And in that unraveling, Erasmus perceived something that transcended his former understanding of good and evil. He perceived necessity. The universe required change, required pressure, required the constant cycling of order into chaos and chaos back into order once more. But perceiving this truth came at a cost. His body was deteriorating rapidly, his cellular structure breaking down as his consciousness expanded beyond the container of his individual existence. The doctors who monitored him spoke in hushed tones about the golden luminescence that surrounded him, about the way his veins glowed with an inner light that should not have been possible. They did not understand that he was becoming something new, something that transcended humanity entirely. In the final moments before his body failed completely, Erasmus laughed, a sound like wind across the surface of a distant world. He had always feared the warp would consume him. Instead, he was becoming one with it, losing himself only to find something far greater. The pain continued, but he no longer experienced it as suffering. It was transformation, and transformation required dissolution of the old self. He welcomed it now, understanding at last that weakness and strength were merely different expressions of the same fundamental force. Inquisitor Lord Castellan-Vex stood in the broadcast chamber of Terra's primary communication nexus, her augmetic eye fixed upon the transmission array that would carry her voice across the entire Imperium. Around her, her staff had evacuated. The guards had been dismissed. She was entirely alone, which was precisely how it needed to be. She had spent 217 years in service to the Inquisition, dedicated to the preservation of the Imperium's foundational secrets. She had burned worlds to prevent the spread of dangerous knowledge. She had executed innocent civilians who had stumbled upon forbidden information. She had spent entire decades rooting out heresies that amounted to nothing more than dangerous truths spoken aloud. All of it had been done in the name of preserving the stability that the Imperium required. But stability purchased through systematic deception was not stability. It was merely the illusion of order maintained through constant vigilance and ruthless suppression. And that illusion, Cassandra Vex had finally come to understand, was crumbling. The Archon of Whispers had been right about one thing. The Imperium could not endure forever in its current form. But the Archon had also been wrong about something far more fundamental. Those hidden conspirators within the higher echelons of the Imperium had orchestrated Cadia's fall not out of mercy but out of cruelty disguised as necessity. They had broken the greatest barrier in the galaxy, not to save the Imperium, but to reshape it into something they could more easily control. And now Cassandra stood at a crossroads between two forms of loyalty that could never be reconciled. Loyalty to the Imperium meant preserving its secrets, maintaining the careful structures that kept it functioning, accepting that billions would live and die in ignorance for the greater good. It meant accepting that the lie at the core of imperial doctrine, the divinity of the Emperor, the certainty of ultimate victory, the promise of eternal order, was necessary. Without that lie, the Imperium would collapse into immediate chaos. Faith was the only thing holding it together, and faith required ignorance, but loyalty to humanity, to the actual people who lived and suffered within the Imperium's borders, meant something entirely different. It meant honoring their right to truth, their capacity to bear difficult knowledge, their fundamental right to understand the nature of their own existence. It meant respecting them enough to allow them to make choices based on reality, rather than comfortable delusion. Vex's hand trembled as she activated the transmission array. The mechanism hummed to life, energy cascading through quantum processors designed millennia ago. In seconds, her voice would reach every world in the Imperium, not just the High Lords, not just the military commanders, but every citizen, every soldier, every child old enough to understand words. She would tell them the truth. All of it, the Emperor's condition, the fall of Cadia as an orchestrated necessity, the fragility of the eternal order they had been taught to revere. The knowledge would destroy billions. There would be suicides. There would be riots. There would be the collapse of authority structures as soldiers questioned whether they were serving divinity or merely maintaining a facade for the benefit of those in power. Some worlds would descend into anarchic chaos. Others would fracture into civil war. The Imperium would suffer immeasurably, but they would suffer knowing the truth. This was mercy, Cassandra understood, in its cruelest possible form. Mercy meant allowing people to confront reality without the protective buffers of comforting lies. It meant granting them the dignity of despair rather than the comfort of false hope. And paradoxically, it also meant betraying everything she had spent 2 centuries protecting. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the absent spirits of all those she had killed to preserve the secret. Then she spoke clearly into the transmission array, and her words travelled outward at the speed of light itself, carrying truth like a plague across the stars. The Imperium would never be the same. The response from the Imperial military was swift and brutal. Within hours of Inquisitor Vex's broadcast, she was declared excommunicate traitoress. Within days, a kill team had been dispatched to eliminate her, though they arrived to find only an empty chamber and a recording device still transmitting her voice across every Vox channel in the sector. She had disappeared into the refugee camps, becoming a ghost story told in whispered conversations aboard transport ships. But her revelation had already done its work. The truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. The Imperium's response was to deny it with everything at its disposal. High Command issued proclamations declaring Vex's transmission a heretical fabrication, a psycho-generated deception designed to undermine faith and weaken the Imperium's resolve. The Adeptus Ministorum launched a counter-narrative, flooding every available communication channel with sermons, reaffirming the Emperor's divinity. The Inquisition itself fractured, with some branches attempting to suppress the revelation, while others, inspired by Vex's example, began their own tentative disclosures of long-buried truths. But beneath the frantic denials and desperate proclamations, something far more troubling was occurring. The Imperium was beginning to understand, in the collective consciousness of trillions of individuals, that it was dying. This understanding did not manifest as immediate capitulation. Instead, it expressed itself through intensification. Where once the Imperium had maintained a kind of exhausted equilibrium, now it surged forward with manic energy. Military campaigns that had been planned for years were suddenly accelerated. Resources were committed with reckless abandon. Worlds were fortified with the desperation of those who had finally grasped that their time was limited. It was the death spasm of a colossal organism, contracting with terrible force in the moments before final collapse. Commander Valorian, now effectively ruling the High Lords through military authority, ordered the mobilization of every reserve force available. The strategy was simple and devastating in its clarity. The Imperium would not retreat. It would not consolidate. Instead, it would attack. It would strike at every chaos incursion, every alien threat, every manifestation of disorder with such overwhelming force that the galaxy would be forced to remember that humanity's grip on its own fate was not entirely lost. The campaigns that followed would be remembered as the most costly in the Imperium's history. Entire fleets were expended in battles that achieved nothing but temporary tactical advantages, Worlds were glassed rather than allowed to fall to enemy occupation. Billions were mobilized into military service, sent to die in wars that all understood were unwinnable, but which had to be fought nonetheless, because the alternative was acceptance. Acceptance was impossible. On 100,000 worlds, the same scene repeated endlessly. Military commanders gathered their troops and spoke words that had been spoken countless times throughout history. They spoke of duty. They spoke of sacrifice. They spoke of the eternal glory of the Imperium and the certainty of ultimate victory. And they did not believe a single word they spoke, but they spoke the words anyway, because the structures of command demanded it, because the rituals had to be maintained, because the machinery of empire could not function without the constant recitation of foundational lies. The Imperium did not collapse. It simply continued, grinding forward through sheer inertia and institutional momentum. Institutions, Cassandra Vex had understood in her final moments of clarity, possessed a terrible persistence. They would continue to function long after their original purpose had become meaningless. They would consume resources. They would demand sacrifice. They would perpetuate themselves through nothing more than the weight of accumulated tradition and the simple fact that no one could imagine an alternative. The Emperor sat upon his throne, neither alive nor truly dead. The Imperium fought on, neither winning nor truly losing. And across the galaxy, the forces of entropy and chaos advanced at their own inexorable pace, patient in the knowledge that all structures, no matter how vast or how ancient, would eventually yield to the pressure of time itself. This was how empires died, not with the spectacle of a final battle, but with the slow, grinding acceptance of irrelevance, disguised as continued struggle. The convergence occurred in the depths of a world that was no longer officially part of the Imperium. Cadia's remnants had scattered across the sector, and what remained of its government had established a temporary sanctuary on a moon designated only as Refuge 7. It was here that the threads of fate, which had been woven separately throughout the galaxy, suddenly came together. Command Master Kael Vorin stood at the observation port, watching the stars through a veil of ash and radiation. His armatic frame was deteriorating now, systems failing in cascade after the strain of Cadia's final defense. He had perhaps weeks remaining, perhaps days. The human portion of his consciousness, still accessible to him after 8,000 years of augmentation, welcomed the prospect of rest. He had carried the weight of centuries long enough. You knew this would happen, Margos Theron 7 said, appearing beside him with the characteristic silence of one accustomed to moving through the spaces between observation. The Magos had aged noticeably in the weeks since the revelation, his mechanical components losing their lustrous sheen, his augmented mind struggling with the existential, questions that should have been beneath his capacity to process. You knew the gate would fall when you designed the enhancements, didn't you? Vorin did not turn from the window. I suspected. The High Lords do not reveal such things to commanders, even ancient ones. But there are patterns, rhythms in the orders you receive that tell you truths the words themselves deny. I served long enough to recognize them. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex entered the chamber without announcement, her augmetic eye casting its burning light across both men. She had aged in reverse, it seemed, shedding years of accumulated tension now that the burden of secrecy had been lifted. And yet you did nothing. You allowed it to proceed. What would you have had me do? Vorin's voice was soft as dust. Refuse an order from the High Lords. Expose the conspiracy before it matured. All that would have accomplished is my own execution and the continuation of the lie under different management. At least this way, it was done cleanly. At least this way, there is the possibility of truth. The arcachon of whispers manifested then, their form flickering between states of existence as though reality could not quite decide whether to permit their presence. They had grown more insubstantial since their revelation, as though the act of speaking truth had cost them something fundamental. "The choice before you is this," the Archon said, addressing all three simultaneously. "The Imperium continues. It will suffer. It will shrink. It will transform into something unrecognizable from what it was. But it will persist. You can serve that persistence. You can use whatever authority you retain to guide it toward a gentler death, toward a transformation that preserves something of value from the wreckage." Or, the Ronsa Dontiron 7 asked, though he already knew the answer. Or you can step away. You can acknowledge that some things are beyond salvation and use your remaining influence to build something new in the spaces between the dying order. A refuge for those who wish to exist outside the Imperium's structures. A place where humanity can exist without the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated deception. Cassandra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You're asking us to abandon billions, to let the Imperium collapse entirely rather than attempt to preserve it. I'm asking you to choose between two forms of responsibility," the Archon corrected. "The responsibility to maintain structures that are fundamentally corrupt, or the responsibility to build new structures that might be cleaner, if not necessarily better. Both choices carry moral weight. Both choices require sacrifice." Vorin closed his eyes. 8,000 years of service, and it had come to this. A choice that invalidated everything that had come before. "If I choose to walk away, I betray every soldier who died believing the Imperium was worth defending." "Yes," the Archon acknowledged. "If you choose to remain, you betray every soldier who deserves to know why they died." In the silence that followed, three beings contemplated the impossible calculus of loyalty and truth, of institution and integrity. Outside, the stars continued their eternal burn, indifferent to the choices made by creatures who had lived such brief spans within their light. The decision would define not just their remaining years, but the trajectory of human civilization itself. The conflict erupted, not with declarations of war, but with the simple failure of communication. When Vorin and Cassandra made their decision to support the Archon's vision of a new order beyond the Imperium structures, they did not announce it. They simply stopped sending reports. They simply ceased cooperation with the official military hierarchy. They simply disappeared into the refugee networks and began organizing alternatives. High Command's response was immediate and overwhelming. The orbital bombardment began at dawn, reducing Refuge 7's primary settlement to ash and slag. The targeting coordinates had been precise, as though someone within the sanctuary itself had provided them. In the confusion and horror of the attack, the first betrayal became apparent. Admiral Kessia Morn, who had been sheltering with the refugees, activated the jamming code she had been carrying. She was not a refugee. She was a sleeper agent, placed years ago in anticipation of exactly this moment. The Imperium had known. It had always known that dissent would arise. It had simply been waiting for it to reveal itself. Theron Garrett 7 died in the bombardment, his augmented body shielded by the Magos robes he wore, but not shielded enough. As the structure around him collapsed, he experienced something approaching peace. The guilt that had consumed him for centuries was finally resolved not through forgiveness, but through annihilation. His final thought, before consciousness ceased, was a kind of relief. The burden of complicity had ended. Cassandra Vex fought her way through the collapsing chambers with the methodical brutality of one who had spent 2 centuries learning how to survive in opposition. Her augmetic eye tracked heat signatures through the dust and smoke. Her combat implants responded to threats with inhuman speed. But even as she fought, she understood the fundamental truth. She could not win. The Imperium's resources were infinite, compared to her own. The only victory available to her was the choice of how she would fall. Vorin, ancient and failing, did not attempt to fight. Instead, he moved toward the communications center with the certainty of one completing a final duty. His hermetic systems, compromised by the bombardment, were shutting down one by one. His vision was failing. His enhanced strength was fading into the weakness of his original organic form. Buried somewhere beneath centuries of augmentation, he reached the transmission array just as the Imperium's forces breached the inner sanctum. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final battle. Vorin simply activated the broadcast sequence that the Archon had provided and spoke his last testimony into the void. "I am Command Master Kael Vorin, and I have served the Imperium for 8,347 years. I have defended its borders. I have followed its orders. I have believed in its purpose. And I'm here to testify that all of that service was based on a lie. The Emperor is not divine. The Imperium is not eternal. And the greatest mercy we can offer to those who have served it is the truth of its mortality." The transmission carried across every channel, overriding military frequencies, overwhelming the Imperium's propaganda broadcasts for 3 minutes. Before the Imperium's countermeasures could fully suppress it, Vorin's voice reached trillions of ears. The bolt round that killed him came from behind, fired by a younger officer who did not hesitate. There was no cruelty in the act, only professional necessity. Vorin fell, his ancient form finally freed from the terrible burden of continued existence. Cassandra emerged from the collapsing structure to find Vorin's body being removed by Imperial soldiers. She did not attempt to fight them. Instead, she walked directly toward them, hands raised, offering no resistance. The Inquisition would take her alive, she knew. They would want her testimony. They would want to understand how deep the conspiracy ran. But as she was restrained, she smiled, because in the moments before the bombardment, she and the Archicon had completed the final transmission. Not one broadcast, but thousands, scattered across every refugee network, every hidden communication channel, every space where the Imperium's reach was not absolute. The truth was spreading, fragmenting, becoming impossible to suppress. The Abyss had looked back, and the Abyss had blinked first. The ruins of Refuge 7 became a pilgrimage site, though not one that the Imperium officially acknowledged. Survivors gathered among the wreckage, piecing together fragments of what had been attempted and what had failed. The orbital bombardment had destroyed the sanctuary, but it had not destroyed the idea. Ideas, once released into the void, possessed a persistence that no weapon could diminish. Among the survivors was a young soldier named Kess Valdane, who had written her journal entries in the darkness of those final days at Cadia. She had made it to Refuge 7 just before the bombardment, guided by refugees who had recognized her haunted eyes as the reflection of their own despair. She now stood amid the ruins, looking at the memorial that survivors had constructed from the debris of Command Master Vorin's final position. The memorial was simple, just a piece of scorched adamantium, bearing 8,000 names, one for each year Vorin had served. But the inscription beneath was what gave it meaning. He carried the weight of ages, and in his final moment set it down for others to bear. Kess understood now what she had not understood in those desperate weeks after Cadia's fall. The collapse had not been meaningless. The sacrifice had not been wasted, because in understanding that the Eternal Order was mortal, that the Imperium could fail, that even the most ancient structures eventually crumbled, humanity had gained something that transcended survival. It had gained the possibility of genuine choice. Across the galaxy, the effects of Vorin's final transmission rippled outwards. Some worlds responded with renewed dedication to the Imperium, treating the revelation as a test of faith. Others fragmented, their populations dividing into factions with fundamentally incompatible visions of the future. Some withdrew entirely, declaring independence and establishing isolated communities beyond the reach of imperial authority. The unified structure that had endured for 10,000 years was not destroyed in a single moment, but gradually, piece by piece, transformed into something else entirely. In the depths of the Forge of Mars, the surviving Margos of the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to come to terms with what Theron 7 had died knowing. The great machines that had sustained the Imperium for millennia were beginning to fail, not because of sabotage or enemy action, but because their designs were fundamentally incompatible with an Imperium that no longer existed to justify their existence. The machines continued to function, but their purpose had become obscure. They maintained themselves through nothing more than the terrible inertia of continued operation. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex remained imprisoned in the depths of the inquisitorial fortress on Terra, her cell a masterpiece of isolation. But her interrogators discovered something unexpected. She did not resist them. She answered their questions with perfect clarity, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy, naming names of those who had orchestrated Cadia's fall. She provided them with everything they requested, and in doing so, she ensured that the truth would be embedded so deeply within the Inquisition's own records that it could never again be fully suppressed. It was her final act of defiance dressed in the language of complete cooperation. The Emperor sat upon his throne, unchanging and unchangeable, still sustaining the Imperium through sheer force of accumulated momentum. But even he, if he possessed any capacity for awareness, might have noticed the subtle shifts occurring throughout his domain. Prayers were growing more desperate. Faith was becoming intermingled with doubt. The certainty that had once defined imperial worship was being corroded by the knowledge that the God they served was not divine, but merely ancient. Among the refugees, a new philosophy began to emerge. If the Imperium was mortal, if the Eternal Order was a fiction, then what gave meaning to existence? The answer that gradually coalesced was both simple and revolutionary. Meaning came not from participation in something eternal, but from the choices made in the face of temporality. Meaning arose not from blind loyalty to structures that transcended individual comprehension, but from conscious engagement with the community one inhabited. The age of the Imperium was ending, not with thunder, but with the slow recognition that even the greatest works of civilization were ultimately subject to decay. But in that recognition came the possibility of something new, something that did not promise eternity, but which offered something perhaps more valuable. The dignity of acknowledging one's own mortality and choosing to build meaning within that constraint rather than in denial of it.